what I realized is that any of us can be creative, right? It's simply creation energy. But for me, I hadn't allowed the space for creation energy. So in designing around my energy and my body, I finally had the space for creative energy.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today I have joining me Amina AlTai. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I was just complimenting her on how beautiful and vibrant her outfit is. So go check it out if you're just listening to this on audio. Anyways, Amina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's such a drab day here in New York that I was like, I need color and vibrancy.
Well, amen. I can definitely relate to that. It's dreary and cold and rain season here where I live in Oregon. So absolutely there, right there with you. But today I'm really excited because the case study we're going to be digging into with Amina is how she was able to really readjust her work schedule and how she approaches really productivity to follow the natural rhythms of her body. And that created an anti-hustle schedule that not only landed a book deal, but also 2x'd Amina's revenue in the first year of implementation. So her revenue went from $220,000 to over $500,000. Now, before we dig into the details of this case study, Amina, I have to hear your Cubicle to CEO story. What was the catalyst that led you to entrepreneurship?
Yes, I love that. So like a lot of people, so I started my career in corporate America and actually worked at Cartier, and it was this amazing experience and I had a wonderful time. But I got to work on their Women's Initiative Awards, which is this contest that provides funding and support to female entrepreneurs. And I was just so enlivened by this. I thought, okay, like I want to start my own company where I get to work with emerging female entrepreneurs all the time. So I co-founded a marketing agency that with a friend that I'd gone to school with. And the idea was on one side to be this hybrid agency where we were taking sweat equity, working with these female founders, and the other side was traditional agency. And I did that for 7 years and I call it my MBA. But I didn't have, like, I was very young and like full of hubris and like, you know, very much that like girl boss, hardworking millennial. And I had a lot of lessons to learn. And I had no boundaries and was deeply codependent. And I ended up burning out and developing 2 autoimmune diseases. And it was very dramatic where I got this call from my doctor and she was like, if you don't go to the hospital now, instead of going to work your days away from multiple organ failure. So I had to kind of change my life. Then I went back to corporate after that because I was like, I need the good insurance. I got to get my life together, and was kind of on this like emotional eat, pray, love year where I was just studying coaching, mindfulness, nutrition, like all the things to feel better in my own life. And after a couple of years back in corporate, I felt so good. I was like, oh, I want to teach this onward. So it was after that that I put together my curriculum that touches on mindset, well-being, and career coaching, and then eventually launched that business. So it was a bit of a bounce between corporate America, entrepreneurship, back to corporate America, back to entrepreneurship, precipitated by a lot of things happening in my body.
Well, what a wake-up call. I mean, there's probably nothing scarier than getting that diagnosis. Like you're literally days away from organ failure. I don't know if in the moment you actually felt that in your body, that you were that close to such a catastrophic health event.
I didn't. It's so funny when I retell, it's not funny at all actually, but when I retell the story, I'm like, you all, this is how disconnected I was at the time. Even though my doctor told me that, I still went to work. And then it kind of took that whole day. And then I was like, maybe I shouldn't be here. And at the end of the day, I got my act together and like went to see the doctor. But that's how disassociated I was at the time, just to kind of get through the day and to survive.
You know, it's really interesting the timing of our conversation, Amina, because last night I was on Threads and I'm definitely a Threads lurker. Like I love reading. I love reading threads. I don't really create content on Threads. Maybe that'll change in 2025. But I was reading this one thread and I can't remember who wrote it to credit them, but they were saying something about how they've observed that parentified children, particularly eldest daughters, tend to later in life develop autoimmune disorders. And I don't know if you are an only child or if you're an older sibling or if you fit into that mold at all. But I just find it so interesting how there's definitely obviously this underlying link between stress and autoimmune conditions. And so anyways, we'll dig into a little bit more as comfortable as you want to get in our case study. But for the purposes of our listeners today, the business that you have now since, you know, going through that back and forth swing of entrepreneurship, corporate back to entrepreneurship, you now coach purpose-driven professionals and you have an upcoming book that's launching in May 2025 as well. Am I allowed to say the title or is that a secret right now?
No, you are. It's officially in pre-order. So we're allowed to say all the things.
Okay, exciting. So it's The Ambition Trap. And I myself myself am very excited to pre-order and read for exactly all the reasons that you just shared, right? Like it's so easy to get caught up. And I've actually never heard a guest coin it as like hubris, but I think that's exactly the right word. It's this belief that we're invincible, that we can just run a million miles a minute and never suffer the consequences of those choices. So love that you phrased it that way. Let's set the stage for our listeners today on this conversation on bodily energy and how, of course, you changed your entire work schedule around this. So bodily energy to increase productivity. How do you, in case a listener's like, what does that really mean? Like, how do you measure or define, let's say, bodily energy? And prior to paying attention to it, did you actually feel unproductive in your life? And that's what kind of spurred you to go, oh, I'm going to do this to make myself more productive? Or was it just, again, a reckoning from, your health scare?
Yeah, absolutely a reckoning from my health scare, because I never felt unproductive. I think if anything, I was, a very productive person and really deriving my sense of self and my self-worth from my productivity. But anytime I am out of integrity, I get called out through my body. Like consistently, it's happened throughout my career. So part of what invited me to create this methodology that we're talking about today is a couple of years into my business, I had toxic mold exposure and I got really sick from it. And I had like zero energy and was like so lethargic. I had all of these symptoms that seem really separate and disparate, but actually eventually we found out were really connected. And so I found myself all of a sudden with very little energy. And as somebody that really derived their sense of self and their worthiness from their doing, there was a bit of an existential crisis there. So I was sitting with this question of, how do I keep the business going while I have so much less energy than I'm used to? And so, I'm a big fan of Elisa Vitti's work around the infradian rhythm. So those of us that have a menstrual cycle, that's an infradian rhythm. It's a 28 to 36 day cycle whereby our hormones are different every day. And this sparked something for me. Not only are our hormones different every day, but those of us that have chronic illness or disability, we're also different every day. And the thing is like people might be listening and be like, well, I don't have chronic illness or disability. Most of us will if we live long enough. And we're seeing so many more people actually are disabled or have chronic illness as a result of the pandemic too. So, and by the way, chronic illness is defined as any set of symptoms that we have that last longer than 6 months. So menopause, technically chronic illness, right? Or if we're dealing with, there's so many things that actually could be classified as chronic illness. So basically this was the impetus for me to think about how can we design our work differently. And so I sat down to design something that could support me in that moment to get through the week and the month. And so I started to think about, well, when's my brain best? When do I have the most energy? What kind of environment do I feel really good in? And that started to shape the framework.
Interesting. So as you were like becoming more aware of these concepts, right, and how they impact your body and your energy levels, which by the way, I'm someone who is very, my brain is always alive, like always, rapid firing, but I consider myself, there's that meme that's like, I'm not an early bird, I'm not a late night owl, I'm a permanently exhausted pigeon or something. And I was like, oh man, I feel so seen by that. That is me to the core. I'm like kind of a low energy person. But how did you actually gain a better understanding of your body beyond just like being aware that, okay, your body fluctuates day to day and hormones and all these other things that impact you, but like, how did you really start to recognize specifics about how this impacts you?
Yeah. As a coach, I'm a firm believer that we all have our own answers. So I started by asking myself a series of questions of, well, when am I the most energized? And for me, it was actually quite obvious. I was like, okay, I am definitely not a night person. Like I have so many friends that can like be working until 12, 1 o'clock and they have these like brilliant creative ideas. Literally, okay, bless you. I wish I were like that. But like 8 o'clock rolls around and I'm like, my eyes are watering. Like I'm literally melting down as a human. So like that part was very obvious, like not a night person, not particularly a very early morning person either, kind of that like 10 to 2 p.m. That's like really where I thrive. So I started to notice that. I also noticed that my brain was sharper at the beginning of the week because I was experiencing so much fatigue that by the end, like I didn't have that much energy and capacity. So then I started front loading my weeks, especially when I was working on the book. So like Monday, Tuesdays, I'd work on the book early in the day. I'd stop around 4. And then Wednesday, Thursday were my coaching days because that's my zone of genius. So it uses a lot less energy. So I could slot it into those days. And then Friday is kind of my spillover day because I don't have that much energy by Friday. My brain's a little duller. And so just starting to notice those trends and then noticing the trends not only in the week, but in the month too. So as I'm in my luteal phase, nearing my menstrual cycle, then I tend to slow down, be a bit more sluggish. So things that I could control, not slating those high energy tasks in that time. So like a keynote or something like that, if I had a bit of control over it, making sure that it happens in the earlier part of my cycle, things of that nature. But I just started by noticing patterns and asking myself some really basic questions.
Okay, I want to get into this question asking process because there's a lot of great information you provided to me ahead of our interview. So I'm going to get into the specifics of each of these things. You've already kind of referenced a few of these questions, but a quick plug for our listeners. If you're listening to this episode with Amina and you're really intrigued by this idea of syncing menstrual cycles with work, we actually did a full debrief breakdown of that particular topic with a previous guest, Kate Northrup. We'll link that episode below in the show notes if you want to listen to that. I'm sure Amina will also touch on some of those pieces in her case study, but just in case you want like a full disagulation, that's probably the best episode to go to because we won't have all the time for that in this particular one. But anyways, that's in the show notes for your reference if you need it. But let's get to these questions. So Amina, you already kind of referenced, like you asked yourself, when do I feel most energized? What type of work do I like doing that comes easier versus more difficult to me? But you also asked questions around when do you need alone time and when do you prefer to collaborate? So walk us through a little bit of what you discovered there.
Yeah, so with alone time, what I realized is that, like, especially when I'm doing deep thinking work, I personally need alone time and I need deep quiet. So that's not the time that I'm going to go to the co-working space to be around energy. Then there's times that I'm like planning something that is collaborative and that's going to be bringing a lot of people and different types of energy together. And then I want to be in other people's energy because it helps lift the energy of that idea too. So then I'm like, oh, I want to be around like all these amazing lady leaders and see what their ideas are, and I want to collaborate. And so, yeah, just simply asking myself those questions has helped me really pinpoint when I need to be in those spaces, when I need to retreat. But also, over the course of the last couple of years, I've started to do more nervous system work, which I love Kate Northrup for so many reasons. She also talks about nervous system work as well. And nervous system work has also shifted my relationship to energy and designing the work week too, because there are times where you have to be collaborative and you don't have a choice about it, right? Like, especially like as entrepreneurs, there's a lot of things that we can control and there's a lot of things that we can't. And so then can we regulate our nervous system in those spaces so that it's less energy expensive? Because that's another thing that was happening for me of you have to go about your business, right? You can't always control the schedule. When you need alone time, but you're in a collaborative space, can you regulate so it's less expensive on the body?
That's a really great point. And I like, again, that term that you're using, less energy expensive. What is a go-to way you have found to regulate your nervous system when, like you just mentioned, you're in one of those situations where you're kind of forced to be collaborative when you would actually prefer alone time?
Yes. So one of my coaches, she's a nervous system coach. She's actually in your neck of the woods. Her name is Amy Bonaducci Gardner. She's in Portland. She's amazing. So she taught me this method called mapping, and it's simply bringing awareness to 2 points in your body, because there's certain parts of our bodies that are black and white indicators of fight or flight, and then certain are specific to us, and they're not necessarily black and white indicators. But for example, our tongue is a black and white indicator. So if it is pointing upward at the top of our mouth, that's an indication of rest and digest. If it's at the bottom, more in the middle, that's an indication of fight or flight. And so if we just simply bring awareness to the tip of our tongue and the bottom of our chin, kind of bouncing between those 2 points for 2 minutes, we will start to notice a shift. And we will start to come more into that rest and digest place simply by bringing awareness, not trying to control something, because that's a little bit tricky in terms of energy. And so that's a really simple tool that you can do anytime, anywhere, which is my favorite. I do it even when I'm coaching with people.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Actually, as you were saying that, I was like noticing where is my tongue right now as we were talking. And I think it was actually touching the roof of my mouth. So I am calm. I am relaxed for this conversation, which is good. That's really helpful though. Thank you for sharing that tip. On the point of you identifying when you need to be alone versus collaborative, is that something that you kind of literally decide day to day as you're waking up and just kind of assessing your energy for that day? Or if you are actually planning out a week based on like, okay, Monday, Tuesday, I need to be alone, but Wednesday, Thursday, I'm going to be with people. How do you accurately predict that if our energy levels fluctuate so much day to day, and also, of course, are impacted by, external circumstances happening around us?
Yes, I think that's a great question. And in my experience, it's more art than science. I don't know that it's like we'll ever get it super perfect and precise. And I think part of our job is to be agile in that while accommodating our needs. But so, for example, I had a week a couple of weeks ago where I had several people's book events and book launches and was out like 4 nights in a row. And I was like, okay, great. That means that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I really would love alone time to regulate, to catch up on things, to restore my energy, to do the things that I need to do. And so it won't always be a perfect science of like, it's my luteal phase. I can only see people 1 day a week. We have to be agile with what's happening in the world around us. But I think checking in ahead of time, looking at our calendars and seeing what's coming down the pike and how can we support our bodies inside of that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And earlier you referenced that on the days where you are more collaborative, sometimes you like being in a co-working space around other, women and leaders. Is the co-working space a membership that you actually already had like before you ever did this work? Or was that an intentional new environment that you placed yourself in after you started to notice, hey, I like to be collaborative certain days of the week, and I'm going to actually create a space where I intentionally am around people during that time?
That's a great question. I think that it shifted seasonally for me. So when I first started my business in the very beginning, that first year I spent, besides coaching time, I spent a lot of time alone. And then I recognized I was like, I'm getting weird. Like I'm literally like waiting for the pigeon to arrive on the windowsill. Like it's time for me to like get some friends, And so then I actively sought out a co-working space and it was game changing. Like, it was just so wonderful to be in that energy 1 or 2 days a week, to go to events, to meet people, to network, all the things. And then when I was writing the book, a very similar thing happened where I'd kind of cut back on collaboration and external engagements and things like that. And I noticed, I was like, I need to be around humans. Like this is too much alone time. So then went back to that idea. So I definitely cycled through depending on the season.
Okay, I love that. And as a former co-working space owner, albeit a very boutique one here in Oregon, I actually started that space for that exact reason, just like wanting to be in community with others, and have made some great, lifelong friends from that adventure. But for our listeners, the takeaway I want to pull away for all of you listening in is, if you've never really considered your physical environment that you actually work in, and you've kind of just gotten in this routine of being in your home office, or maybe you have a rented office space, maybe think through, are there other environments that you could intentionally place yourself in that are better suited towards certain types of work or certain types of energy levels that you have at different points in the week? So that's my little homework from Amina to you.
I love that. Also, are you a fan of human design?
I am, but so I know so little. I know I'm a manifesting generator, and I know my lines are 3 and 5, and I have kind of a general sense of understanding of that. But other than that, I'm totally a newbie.
Okay, great. So for those listening that don't know about human design, it's a body of work somewhat similar to astrology. It essentially gives us like what we're called to do in this lifetime. And it gives us all these kind of breadcrumbs and a bit of a roadmap for our purpose and our energy and all the things. And I really love human design. I often send my clients for a reading because it has implications for how we do our work and how much energy we have and all of those things. So I think it's really fun to look at. But also inside of human design, they tell us our optimal environments. And so my optimal environment is a market, which is where a place where businesses, ideas, different things come together. And that makes so much sense because that's essentially a co-working space. And so I think that's a really fun thing to look at as well if people want like an external perspective on their environment.
Ooh, that's a great add-on tip. Actually, that term market, the first time I heard it was last week when I had, ironically, a coffee date with one of my friends who I met through the co-working space that I opened. And she was literally talking about how she recently just discovered this and was like trying to explain it to me. So 2 times in 1 week, I think that's a prompt for me to go look at what I am. Yeah.
Yes, totally.
That's awesome. So then we've talked about like being in an environment either with people or without people. Let's talk about some of those more like introspective parts that you're also considering. Like when you do your best thinking, when you're most creative, where do you find you get your best ideas? And was there any sort of process of testing that allowed you to arrive at that conclusion?
Yes. And I think that sort of connects to the case study. So when I started designing my work weeks like this, it sort of became like a virtuous circle where where I had more time. And when I had more time, I had more time to kind of think and wonder. Like I had space, which I had never really had before. And in the space came the creative thinking for me, came like the insights and the messages and the ahas. And there's actually science around this. Even, and I at one point was doing this for my team, like even giving people 1 hour a week to sit and do nothing, the creative juices start to flow, the insights start to flow. We access that creative brain in a bigger way. And that's something that really happened and opened up for me. And it's funny because I once did this workshop that was around tapping into your creativity. And I almost had an existential crisis when I went into the workshop because I was like, I'm not a creative person. Like, what is this? And what I realized is that any of us can be creative, right? It's simply creation energy. But for me, I hadn't allowed the space for creation energy. So in designing around my energy and my body, I finally had the space for creative energy.
I really resonate with what you're saying because right now I'm actually kind of going through a little shift internally in our own business where I'm intentionally making some changes structurally, both within our team and within like the company at large in terms of, what we're going to be offering and whatnot in the first 6 months of 2025 to create that white space, if you will, to just think. I'm super excited because I think I just love to sit and think and be with my thoughts. I know some people find their thoughts scary. I actually really like to just be with my thoughts. And so very much looking forward to what comes out of that. So I very much resonate with what you're sharing there.
I can't wait to see what comes out of that. Literally time, I mean, it's such a privilege and, not afforded to everybody, but if we can carve out that time because we're maximizing our energy in other spaces, I think what comes back is pretty magical.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll keep you informed, I guess, on the experiment there. You, Amina, but also you guys at large listening to this podcast. So these are some of the things you're thinking through on a weekly basis. But if we kind of zoom out a little bit and we're looking more on a monthly basis or even further expanded beyond that, pace is like a very interesting thing to consider. How do you determine when you need to slow down versus the opposite, when you realize I actually can and should speed up?
Yeah. So a lot of that is informed by my cycle. So the first part of my cycle, I tend to have a lot more energy. I tend to think a lot more clearly. Everything is just spinning a lot faster. And so in those moments, like I can really maximize. Like that's when I could probably bang out a program in 2 days, right? And it's pretty magical when we actually allow ourselves to flow with the energy versus being like, okay, I've got to do 30 minutes every day or whatever is true to you. You'll see what you can create and what you can come up with is just bigger, faster, juicier because you're leveraging your energy. So the first half of the month, generally, I am a bit faster. My pace is faster. What I can produce bigger, all of those things. And then I tend to taper off. And it's sort of a natural, especially now, like I just hit 42. So there's like this, there's a day where I'm like, okay, I notice like we're more tired today. If normally I'm, starting to wind down by 7, 8, like by 6 o'clock, I'm feeling like that tug of time to take a break. Maybe you sit under your weighted blanket. So the body is giving us signals all the time. And so I've now become so accustomed to paying attention to those signals, which for a very long time I couldn't hear them at all.
Right. And could you give me an example of a time where you actually sped up, where you realized you were moving too slow?
Yeah. So I don't know that I realized I was moving too slow, but so last year I launched this program called Authenticity Pays. It's an accelerator. And so I wanted to do a free week of coaching leading into the accelerator as lead gen. And so I did this free week of coaching and I sat down. It was like literally the first 2 weeks of my cycle and it was fantastic. The content that I prepared in that week, I was like, this is game changing. I'm like, who is this woman? Like, she's so smart. She's so fast. Like, literally, it just kind of flowed out of me. And then it was interesting because this year, so this was last year, so this year I wanted to add in a module of content and I wasn't paying attention to my energy. I was in the second half of my cycle and it was so laborious to add in another module. I was like, you know what? I'll just wait because in a couple weeks it'll just flow out of me. But right now it was like pushing a boulder up a hill. It was so funny.
I mean, it is fascinating, because you're obviously the same person, the same human in both cases, but it is just absolutely astonishing sometimes how different we can show up to a certain task, just like you said, depending on our energetic capacity. Just for our listeners who maybe haven't tuned into the Kate Northrup episode I referenced, or are, again, new to this concept of like cycles syncing with, your work schedule. When you say first part of cycle versus the second half of your cycle, is the first half of your cycle, are you referring to like the period of time before you actually have your period, or like what is that referring to?
Yes. So follicular phase. And then second half is luteal luteal. And, so we're talking a lot about cycle, but the reason that I bring in like, look at your day, look at your week, is that some people feel consistent throughout their cycle, right? It's really different for everybody. I have one client who's a CEO and she feels really different day to day, but not so much over the course of the month, not so much based on the menstrual cycle. But one example is, by the end of the day, her brain's pretty done. And she was telling me one day, she was like, it took me 2 hours to write an email. And I was like, stop, just like try again tomorrow morning. And she's like, you're right. Literally, I got up the next day and it was 5 minutes. And so just noticing your own flow, your own rhythm, because you might be like, actually, the menstrual cycle doesn't have that big of an impact on me week to week and I'm totally fine.
Right. No, that's an excellent point there. Do you find yourself distinguishing between pace and intensity at all, or are they more or less the same to you in terms of what you've already described so far?
It's funny, like I have a visual around pace and intensity. Pace is like wide, intensity is deep. And so like I'm thinking about, like when I think about my pace, like how fast am I going? And, when do I need to like bounce forward and pick up speed? And when I think about intensity, it's like deepening in that as well, if that makes any sense.
I like the visual, the, wide versus deep, but it might help if you had a specific example tied to that, like something that you change the pace of and then something you change the intensity of. Does anything come to mind for you?
Well, okay. So partly how I got on the court with this framework too was in the pandemic, working with a lot of clients around like the pandemic is an endurance race and sort of using the metaphor of a marathon with a lot of people. And that particular marathon asked us to keep the pace, right? Like every day put one foot in front of the other and like some consistency to that pace. And then I think that there were moments of emotional intensity and we were still asked to move forward and to keep the pace. And so I feel like that's a great example because it's like you're still putting one foot in front of the other. And then there are these emotional moments that add weight, almost like you're wearing a weighted vest as you continue to keep the pace. And that to me, like always felt like a really interesting example.
No, that's a really great analogy. And kind of like you said, being cognizant of what are those influential factors that could make something feel more challenging or less challenging and to just have awareness around that. Speaking of which, we've talked about physical environment. I think the last layer of just kind of setting this general context up for our listeners around, how you're looking at energy levels in planning and designing your work week is the energetic environment. So with that, how does that to you differ than a physical environment? And how do you approach your energetic environment on great days versus on your most challenging days?
Yeah. So I'm, on the spectrum, like probably a little bit more spiritual and woo-woo. So I like to bring in those practices depending on what people are like open for too. Like my clients are all in a spectrum as well. And so for me, there's the physical environment, right? That's the actual physical space, the four walls, the windows, how much light's in the space, how ventilated it is, right? Thinking about those things. Then there's the energy of the space, right? Who has been in the space and what energy have they picked up and left behind? Like what's happened in the space before and what energy has been picked up and left behind. And I'll give you all a great example. So I work from home most of the time and I got divorced over the last year. And when I got divorced, I was like, you know what? I'm the only energy in this space now. I want to reevaluate the energy of the space. And so I worked with a healer to cut cords, which is a process of basically reorganizing the energy of a space because the energetic environment was shifting and I wanted to make sure that the space reflected that as well. And so it might sound a little woo-woo, but I often think of our space and our home and our workplaces as like the root chakra. That's like the grounding. And if the energy of the space doesn't feel right, then I think it has an impact on our work. I also had the opportunity to work with somebody a couple of years ago who was a space designer that also leveraged feng shui. And so that also has energetic implications for our work too. And so I think that's a super interesting technology to bring in as well.
So I'm curious, I'm not super familiar with feng shui, although I've met, many amazing people in our community who are experts in that. What is one shift in your environment that working with a feng shui expert that you decided to do as a result of that? Can you share a specific example?
Oh yes, so many fun ones. So one thing that they said to me, so feng shui is based on a map called the bagua. So the bagua is like this map that you lay over your home and certain corners or of the map correspond to different areas of your home and different areas of your life. So one corner is about money, one corner is about health, one corner is about relationship, etc. So you layer that over your house and then you make certain choices. But one thing that she said for me, she was like, as somebody that has autoimmune disease, it's really important that you move the energy of your closets and your garbage. So she's like, anything that has a tendency to like collect and stack up, she's like, you have to move out quickly. So she's like, always clean your closets, take your garbage out every day. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. She also told me about where I put my desk. So she was like, desk, like creative energy, work energy, the energy around it needs to really flow. So had my desk up against a wall, and she's like, no, the energy needs to move around it, take it away from the wall, and like give it some more space around the perimeter. What else did she tell me? Oh, also, so my front door, it doesn't face a back door, which is a big no-no in feng shui, but it faces these big windows. And so she was like, you want something in the space to dance with the energy, so the good energy doesn't come in the front door and then bounce out the back windows. So she's like, either get like a big beautiful chandelier, or like I actually got a marble coffee table, so the energy anchors the room and the energy can kind of dance around it versus going right out the window.
That sounds so beautiful. I love the way you phrase that. The energy dancing. Like I literally see that in my mind. Thank you. That's actually very, very helpful. It's kind of got me thinking. I'm recording this right now. My desk is positioned in the middle of this room. So there's like plenty of space behind it and, or in front of me and behind me. And so now I'm kind of thinking, I wonder if that is playing any sort of role. And to your point, I know obviously our listeners kind of fall also on a diverse spectrum in terms of their spirituality and faith. And I know for a long time for myself, I always was very skeptical of any sort of like what people would consider woo-woo things. But the more I could understand the science behind some of these concepts, especially like the idea that, we're all made up of atoms and atoms have energy, right? So like the scientific pieces of it, I think help my more logical mind wrap around it. So I love the specific examples. Very, very helpful. So I feel like now our listeners have this kind of like overarching context for how you worked through all these different questions in the process to really design your work week around these principles of honoring your bodily energy. You kind of already gave us a little bit of a preview of like what your average week in your life looks like. Are there any other details you want to fill in the gaps for us on in terms of like your average work week design now that you've really, practiced these concepts for a long time?
I think it's really important that we tell the people that we're collaborating with how we work optimally. So one of the things I do with my clients is I have them make a how to work with me document.
Ooh, love that.
That they share with their teams. And the how to work with me document also contains their energy flows, right? So I'm not somebody that will answer emails late in the night or on the weekends, and so schedule send for me. Or I'm a direct communicator, but if you find that I'm being, less direct, maybe I'm in a stress response. So I think it's really helpful to put together these documents, like these how-to guides for people, because as we're understanding ourselves, we can help other people understand us too, so that we can just collaborate much more harmoniously. And so I think that's really fun. But once you're thinking about how people can work with you, you're starting to ask yourself those questions of like, when do I want to give feedback, and when do I collaborate, and when do I want to live alone? So you're starting to unfold inside of that as well.
Yes, it's so timely to you saying this, because I was actually just chatting with my husband the other day about, we've been in the season of life where we've just been really wrapped up in, a custom build. We just built a duplex, we sold our house, we moved, like all these things. And I was realizing over the course of many of these projects that even though I've, communicated like certain boundaries isn't the right word, but guidelines, right? Like you said, of communication within my business, I never really thought to translate it to my personal life projects. But now that I've been through this experience, I was telling him how in the future, when I'm hiring someone, even for like a personal task, one of the top things I want to be sure of is like, how do you best communicate? Like, are you because I'm an over communicator. Like I would rather be told too many things than kind of be left to wonder for myself, but not everyone is that way. And so just kind of realizing that about myself, and that I like to really be kept in the loop because I'm such a detail oriented person, was just an interesting discovery. So I feel like the timing of what you just shared there is a great takeaway for all of our listeners, and a great resource just to have on hand for life purposes too.
Yes. I actually had a friend who used the how to work with me document and gave it to someone she was dating. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Because it has communication guidelines in there. It has boundaries. Why not?
Why not? Exactly. Hey, they're probably going to have less conflict over the course of their relationship because of that. That's so awesome. What about if we're looking on a way more zoomed out scale, like a quarterly or yearly or even longer. Are there any sort of patterns that you've developed as it relates to honoring your bodily energy? The reason that what inspired this question was I was thinking about what I had read one time about Bill Gates. He like builds in this like 2 week retreat every year where he like goes away and all he does is read books for 2 years or not 2 years, 2 weeks. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. That's such an interesting practice. I'm just curious, is there anything like that you've implemented on a quarterly or yearly basis based on honoring your body's energy?
Yes. So I actually have this formula and it's connected to pricing and our offering as well. But based on like what we're pricing, how many weeks we want to take off, all of those things, how are we designing our year? So I want to, and I've done this based on my pricing and the services that I'm offering, take off 6 weeks per year. And so then how am I putting those 6 weeks in my calendar? And I usually advise my clients to put those 6 weeks a year ahead of time, just so they're locked and loaded and like we have no excuses, they're already on there. And then in those 6 weeks, what do we want to be achieving based on our dreams and our goals? So, is a dream to be swimming in the Mediterranean once a year? Great. Which one of the 6 weeks are we going to be doing that? Is a dream to be thinking about giving ourselves time to think so we can dream up that next project? Great. When are we going to do that? And so using the calendar, it is so our friend to bring structure and rigor to our life goals and dreams, and that being part of the planning process as well.
Do you personally pack your 6 weeks together, like back to back in one big lump sum, or do you spread them out throughout the year?
I spread them out. So what I notice about myself is I am not an endurance runner. So, a few minutes ago, I used that example of like the pandemic being this endurance race. I'm not an endurance runner. I'm a sprinter. And so in my sprinting metaphor, I'm somebody that's really good at working intensely for a couple of weeks, and then I need to retreat and take a break. Work intensely for a couple of weeks, retreat and take a break. And so I need time off once a quarter really to kind of honor that. And so that's what I've built for myself. But great questions for people to ask themselves too. Are you more in the sprinting energy? Are you more in the endurance energy? And then based on that, where would you put your time off?
And when you build in this time off, do you always find for yourself personally that you are matching your time off with time away from your normal routines in your home? Or are you someone that actually gets a lot of rest in taking time off at home?
It's more for me time away. So kind of going back to that space for creativity, wonder is such a big and important tool for all of us. So experiencing new spaces and cultures actually is really good for the nervous system. So anything new, anything novel requires us to be more present. And so there's all these amazing impacts of being in new spaces and having novel experiences. So as much as I can, I try to have novel experiences, but I also need time at home, to take care of my plants and make sure everything is taken care of and all of those things. So it's more time away for me, but I do have the occasional week at home, the occasional staycation.
Love a good staycation. Also, glad you brought that up, this idea of novel concepts, because I remember years ago learning that if you feel like time passes you by, which is definitely a common recurrence for me where I'm like, oh my gosh, this day went by so quickly. A mentor of mine said, if you want time to stretch time, to feel like you have more time in the world, she said exactly that. Go and create novel experiences or just like switch up your environment, because it forces your brain to slow down and pay attention rather than being on automation. And that makes time feel more expansive, even if you didn't actually increase the amount of time available in the day. So I love that reminder. For your book, how did all of these concepts and the change in how you designed your work week, how did the book come out as a result of this?
So as a result of this, I had a lot of spaciousness in the calendar. And as someone who historically had derived their sense of worth and self from work, it was a little trippy. Like, is this space okay? And it was a novel experience for me for sure. And it took me time to adjust to it. But then after that, I was like, okay, I'm flowing. I'm getting more creative. I'm thinking about new programs and things like that. And then I happened to be sitting with a client taking her through a framework, and she was like, where's your book? Do you have a book? And I was like, it's funny you should ask. I don't. And then she was like, a dear friend of mine just became an agent. Like, I just feel like I need to put the two of you together. And then she put the two of us together. We just really hit it off. She really understood me and my work and saw me fully. And then because I had time, we took the next 4 months to work on a proposal together. But if I was like running and gunning at 1,000% and had no time or space in the calendar, one, I wouldn't have been able to think creatively. Two, I wouldn't have had the days in the week or the hours in the week to actually put the proposal together. And so it made space for something that I'd always wanted.
That's incredible. And what's even more impressive, I think, is, you spent months working on this proposal, but then when you actually put it to market, your book sold within a week, and it was bought. This is something new I learned from your pre-interview information you submitted. It was bought in pre-empt. This is a new term to me because I'm obviously not from the publishing world. Can you explain to our listeners what a pre-empt is and what you feel differentiated your book so much that it was in that high of demand when it came time for publishers to be able to bid on it?
Yeah, thank you. So a preempt is when publishers are really excited about the work. So they offer you a really high amount to make sure that you don't take the book to other publishers and then there's a bidding war. So a lot of times what happens is you take your book to market with your agent and then you meet with different publishers. Maybe you get one offer if you're lucky. Maybe you get a couple offers. If you get a couple offers, there can be a bidding war where they're trying to outbid each other in order to get the work if they like it enough. But they liked my work so much, they were like, please don't take it to other publishers. We want to give you enough so you'll let us have it. And I really loved my publishing house too. So I was like super happy to make that happen. Also, it was like more than I ever thought that I would get for the book too. So it was this very special moment and a big deal for me as a first time author as well. And I think what really led to that was like the creativity because, and I've experienced this in my life, when I'm working from that space of burnout or not having much energy, it's like I'm dialing it in. Sure, like maybe I'm doing a decent job and from the outside, maybe people wouldn't realize. But I'm not thinking of like the spectacular, the next level, the depth, the nuance. Having the time and having the energy and having the creative brain allowed me to, I think, serve up a level of nuance that they hadn't seen. And so they were very excited about that. And I think I honestly think that made the difference.
Absolutely. And to further like clarify that, what is the nuance that you think they saw?
Yeah, so my book is about ambition. It's called The Ambition Trap. And so ambition for a lot of people is a dirty word depending on your intersectionality. So men are told to take up space, and when they're ambitious, they're seen as powerful and strong. When women speak truth to power and are standing in their ambition, they're often seen as the B word or aggressive. And so we have all these rules about who gets to be ambitious and who doesn't get to be ambitious. At the same time, I think a lot of what we understand about ambition is misleading. Ambition, in my opinion, is neutral and natural, that every living thing on the planet has ambition because it's simply a desire to unfold. So like grass has ambition, like a cheetah has ambition because you just want to unfold. And humans, we're the only ones that actually have a choice in how we direct that energy. But a lot of us direct that energy from a place of pain. So a lot of us are, and this was me, this is why I wrote the book on ambition. We write the book that we need. So we're chasing our bigness from a core wound like rejection or abandonment. And so, for my wound was rejection. And so I felt like, okay, people rejected me. So I'm going to take up all this space and I'm going to get all these awards and I'm going to get to the top of the career ladder. And that's where my ambition was coming from. But that's a very wobbly place to source our ambition from. So in the book, I invite you to instead come from a place of purposeful ambition, which is where we heal the core wounds and we allow that place to come from an organic in-sourced place versus the external measures. And so no one was talking about ambition in that way. And I think I was able to dig into it in that way because I had the space and time and energy.
Fascinating. Well, you just got me even more excited to read your book. So thank you. Thank you for sharing, the thought process and the inspiration behind it. How else did you feel that designing your work week around your body's energy capacity improved your business? So obviously you got an amazing book deal out of it. And that's a huge accomplishment in and of itself. But also, at the beginning of this conversation, I referenced how in the first year of implementing this approach, you actually increased your revenue by almost 2x from $220,000 to over $500,000 in revenue. And then since then, there's been even more growth. But how specifically did this increase revenue? Because I think sometimes we hear, okay, so you designed your work week differently. You're more rested, more peaceful, more in tune with your needs. But how does that effectively translate into more revenue? I think that's the puzzle piece that we'd love your help in kind of illuminating.
Yeah, I think there's two ways. One, I think that I was coming from a place of scarcity, both time scarcity and money scarcity. So I was like, let me work all of the hours and then, be delivering this service in this way. But I was coming from that place of scarcity. But when I dialed back the hours, there was space. And also I was like, I think I've been really undervaluing my service because I've been coming from this place of scarcity. And so I had a really honest conversation with my coach at the time where she was like literally, lady, you need to double, what is happening here? And I was like, I guess you're right. I've just been so scared and coming from this place of scarcity. And so I doubled my prices. And I remember being terrified, but also it's like the people that want to come with you are going to come with you. And the people that don't, they're they're going to fall away, and both things are totally fine. And then you're going to magnetize the people that are more aligned. And I think also living the way that I was living and working the way that I was living, I started to magnetize people that wanted to live and work the same way. So I started to get all of these clients that didn't want to instrumentalize their body, that didn't want to hustle and grind. And so by being more of who we are, we will attract more of the right people.
That's powerful. Did you publicly document and talk a lot about the changes you were making and how you were, changing the way you work, and you feel like that external processing, if you will, brought in these people? Or was it more kind of nuanced and subtle, and it was just like something people observed in you naturally that kind of drew them to you?
I think it's both. So at first, I think it was the more subtle, because I'm a firm believer of teaching from the scar and not the wound. So, in those early days, as I was figuring it out, I wasn't telling anybody about it. I was waiting to get my sea legs and understand what was going on before I would teach it forward. But I think that people could sense a shift in me, and then they wanted to be around me, and they were like, "What's she doing? It's looking good over there. Like, can we have a piece of that?" And so I think that was definitely the impetus initially. And then as I started to talk about it, people wanted to learn more. And then all these people come out of the woodwork that are navigating burnout or chronic illness, or just want to work differently because the world that they've been working in just hasn't felt right or aligned or good anymore.
Right. No, absolutely. I can definitely see that is kind of like a chronic illness in and of itself. Like, just the amount of people who feel that way for long periods of time. Outside of increasing your pricing, so, doubling your pricing, but also, of course, attracting more right fit clients, is there anything else you changed in either the offers you sold, either eliminating some that you used to sell that you no longer sell, or maybe creating a brand new offer, or anything else about the structure of your business that you want to impart on our listeners that you feel like also moved the needle significantly in terms of the revenue jump?
So again, like, in terms of like spirituality, it's a really big thing for me. And I always say, like you were saying, there's science behind all of it. And I believe that. And also, like, take what works for you and throw away what doesn't. I say that to my clients all the time. But also, when I stopped coming from that place of scarcity, I started to look at and think about sales as really a spiritual practice and like a very spiritual exchange. Like, I wasn't afraid to lose people. I wasn't afraid. Like, I think so many times, and I teach this now, like I have a whole curriculum on sales as a spiritual practice and active service, because I think so much of the time we're so afraid to get the no. We go into that conversation and we're like gripping for the yes, but that doesn't serve anybody. That's really manipulative energy if we think about it. And so in really kind of looking at the scarcity and healing that wound, then I was going in there and I was like, I just want to hold the best container for your transformation, whether it's with me or somebody else. And so in this conversation, I just want to help you get clear, whether that's clear that it's a yes or clear that it's a no. And so that was a really big piece of the journey for me as well.
We are so aligned there. That is exactly how I teach selling. I'm like, your job is to be a guide and almost like a facilitator for their decision-making process. It has nothing to do with convincing, coercion, or persuasion of either direction, like you said. So love that we're both 100% on the same page there. Amina, this has been extremely helpful. Is there a best place for our listeners to continue to connect with you? And then also, of course, to pre-order your book, The Ambition Trap.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a joyful conversation, such a fun one. I'm usually used to like, well, let's like talk specifically about the framework and this tool. So it was really nice to have this more energetic conversation. So thank you so much for having me. You can learn more about me on Instagram at Amina AlTai. I'm sure the spelling will be in the show notes. My website is the same. It's aminaaltai.com. And then you can get my book everywhere books are sold. So whether that is Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, bookshop.org, it is everywhere.
Amazing. Well, we'll include all of those links below for you guys in the show notes if you're listening on the podcast, and in the video description if you're on YouTube. Thank you again, Amina, for joining us. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll catch back up with you in next week's episode.